The photograph was still in its envelope the first time I saw it, edges yellowed, the paper thin as breath. It showed 3 young men standing by a campfire under a mountain sky, all smiling. But in the corner, half hidden by glare, was the faint outline of a 4th shape, the blurred silhouette of a man watching from the trees. That image has followed me for years like something waiting just beyond the frame. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. Back then, Clear Rock County was the kind of place where nothing ever changed. Mornings came soft through the cottonwoods, and the air smelled faintly of lake water and wood smoke. Folks waved to each other from pickup trucks, and you could drive 50 miles without seeing a traffic light. The sheriff's office was a squat brick building beside the diner, and everyone knew everyone by name. That summer of 2012 felt unusually kind. The snows had melted early. The grass on the lower slopes was already tall, and the mountains looked freshly scrubbed, almost new. The town leaned into the quiet season before the 4th of July crowd would fill the lakefront cabins. Back then, I was still on the job, mostly paperwork and the occasional call about a black bear getting into someone's trash. Jack, Michael, and Thomas. They were local boys, grown but still carrying the ease of small-town friendship. Jack worked at the auto shop on Main Street, hands always streaked with oil. He'd stop by my office sometimes to borrow the department's air compressor or share coffee from that dented thermos he carried. Michael taught history at the middle school. He had a calm way about him, the sort of man parents trusted with their kids. Thomas was younger, sharper around the edges, the one always pushing for a new trail or a longer climb. Together they were inseparable, the kind of friends who spent more time in the hills than at home. I remember the Friday before they left. I'd seen their truck at the gas station just before dusk. The 3 of them were loading up on fuel jerky and coffee, the essentials for a weekend up near Crystal Lake. They waved when they saw me. Jack hollered something about bringing me back a trout if the fish were biting. The sun was low, casting long golden lines across the pavement, and for a moment it looked like the whole world was holding its breath. The lake sits about 20 miles north of town, tucked between high ridges and miles of pine forest. It's the kind of place you go to hear yourself think, no cell signal, no road noise, just wind through the trees and the soft lap of water against the stones. Rangers keep a small outpost nearby, mostly to check permits and keep an eye out for fires. Back then, the senior ranger was Ron Harvey, a man everyone trusted. He'd worked those woods longer than most of us had lived there. He had a slow drawl, a stiff walk, and a reputation for knowing every trail by heart. The night they left, the weather was clear 72 degrees at sunset, a light breeze from the west. My wife and I sat on the porch listening to the crickets, the kind of quiet evening that belongs only to mountain towns. I remember thinking how still everything was, how steady life felt when you knew every road, every face. That's what small towns do. They trick you into believing the world can't possibly turn against you. Over the weekend, things carried on as usual. Saturday morning brought the farmer's market the smell of fried dough and coffee drifting down Main Street. By Sunday, church bells rolled through the valley, echoing off the hillsides. No one had reason to notice that 3 tents stood empty by the lake's edge, their campfire cold, their laughter gone. It's strange how memory works, how the details that once felt ordinary come back later with weight you can't explain. I can still see that old Ford truck they drove, mud on the tires, a cooler wedged in the back. I can still hear Jack's laugh. It wasn't until days later that I'd realize that was the last time anyone in Clear Rock saw them alive. Ron Harvey the ranger stopped by my office that following Monday. He was checking on supply deliveries, nothing more. But looking back, I remember something in his eyes, a kind of hesitation. At the time, I took it for fatigue. The man worked long shifts in the sun, often alone. Now I'm not so sure. As the week went on, small things began to tug at me. Mrs. Randall called the station asking if we'd seen her son's truck on the way back from the lake. She said Michael had promised to call Sunday night. He's never late, she told me. Her voice cracked when she said it. By Tuesday, Thomas's mother showed up too, said she'd driven to the trailhead herself and found nothing but tire tracks fading in the dirt. Still, there was no reason to panic, not yet. Folks lose track of time out there all the time. Maybe they'd hiked deeper than planned. Maybe they'd stayed an extra night. That's what we told ourselves. I remember walking out behind the station, the sun sinking behind the ridge, and telling one of my deputies they'll be home by tomorrow. But tomorrow came and went, and with it a feeling settled in that I couldn't quite name, a stillness that didn't feel peaceful anymore. By Thursday, the weather had shifted. Clouds hung low over the mountains, the kind that move slow and heavy, swallowing the peaks. The lake road looked darker that day, the air colder. It was the kind of change you feel before you see. I didn't know it then, but the world as I knew it, the town, the trust, the quiet rhythm of our lives was already beginning to crack. That night I left the office later than usual. The phone on my desk sat silent, the air in the building still. Out on Main Street, the porch lights were glowing, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then stopped. I stood at the door for a moment, looking toward the dark line of mountains, wondering if the boys were already heading home. But no headlights appeared on that empty road. Just the sound of the wind coming down from the lake, steady, cold, and wrong. The night I realized the 3 boys hadn't come home, the air over Clear Rock felt heavier than usual. You could smell the storm coming, that sharp metallic scent that hangs in the pines before rain. I didn't sleep much. Every time I turned out the light, my mind drifted back to that empty road, the way the mountains looked black against the sky, and the stillness that didn't belong. By morning, the calls had started. Jack's sister phoned first, asking if there'd been any word. I told her not to worry, that sometimes campers lost signal for a few days. But as the sun came up and no one heard from them, I knew that line didn't sound convincing anymore. By noon, I had 2 deputies and a ranger heading toward the lake. The ranger on duty that week was Ron Harvey. Everyone in town trusted him. The man had 20 years in those mountains, knew every ridge and ravine. When I called to ask what he'd seen over the weekend, he said the weather had been clear, no reports of slides or bears. His voice was calm, almost too calm. He said he'd check the lake perimeter and get back to me. I remember thanking him and hanging up, but something about the tone of his voice stayed with me. It wasn't indifference exactly, but distance, like he was choosing his words too carefully. We started the official search that afternoon. Deputies fanned out along the lake while a team of volunteers followed the trail toward the old quarry road. The boys' truck was still parked by the tree-lined quays, gone cooler half full, 1 tent bag missing. The fire pit by the water was cold. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no tracks leading out. It was as if the 3 of them had just stepped into the forest and vanished. For the first few days, I told myself it was a simple rescue. Maybe they'd lost their bearings and were holed up somewhere higher up the ridge. The days stretched long and quiet, the kind of silence that makes the world feel endless. We used dogs' drones, even borrowed a helicopter from the next county. Nothing. The forest was too wide, the terrain too cruel. On the 4th night, I stood by the lake watching the searchlights sweep across the water, and for the first time I felt something I hadn't in all my years of service, the weight of helplessness. We interviewed the few campers who'd been there that weekend. One older fisherman said he'd seen a fire burning late by the water and thought he heard voices, maybe an argument, but the wind carried it off before he could tell what was said. Another family camping a mile away mentioned seeing a flashlight beam cut through the trees long after midnight. But no one saw the men leave, and no one heard a shot. Ron Harvey reported in every morning, his notes neat, his manner steady. He told us he'd covered the eastern ridge twice, found no trace of them. I remember standing beside his truck one evening, the sky going dark behind us, and saying, "Ron, I know these woods are rough, but something doesn't sit right." He looked at me a long time before answering. "Sometimes, Sheriff," he said quietly, "the mountains just keep what they take." It struck me as strange then, poetic almost, but I chalked it up to fatigue. After a week with no sign of the men, the county declared the search exhausted. The families were told the likely cause was an accident. Maybe they'd slipped into a ravine. Maybe an animal attack. I signed off on the report, though my pen shook when I did. That was the last official word for 11 years. Life somehow went on. I retired a few years later, passed the badge to my nephew Daniel, and tried to make peace with the things I couldn't solve. It wasn't until the spring of 2023 that the past came knocking again. Daniel called me one morning, his voice low, asking if I could come by the office. I could tell right away it wasn't routine. When I walked in, he had a box sitting on the table, sealed with tape so old it had gone brittle. On top of it lay a folded note from an auction house clerk. They'd been sorting through the belongings of a retired ranger named Ron Harvey. Yes, that same Ron, and had found personal items belonging to the 3 missing men. Backpacks, maps, even a camera wrapped in cloth. I felt the blood leave my face. Daniel slit the tape carefully and lifted the lid. Inside were 3 worn packs, still tagged with the men's initials. Jack's old flashlight was there, the one he'd had since high school. Thomas's flask dented on the side, and a map yellowed, folded with markings in blue pencil. 2 words stood out beside a circled spot, burial site. Daniel didn't say anything for a while. Neither did I. It was as though time itself had paused, the air in the room suddenly thick and stale. There are moments in this line of work when instinct overrides logic. You can't explain it, you just feel it, that deep certainty that something terrible has been hiding in plain sight. I had it then. Whatever happened to those boys, Ron Harvey knew more than he'd ever said. Daniel drove out to the address listed on the auction papers, a small house near the Wyoming line. I went with him. The place was quiet. Garage door, half-open boxes stacked inside like someone had been packing in a hurry. The smell of oil and dust hung heavy. We found the camera on a shelf still wrapped in its cloth and 3 rolls of undeveloped film inside. Back at the station, Daniel called an old photographer he knew, a local named Tim, to develop the rolls. We waited in silence as he worked in the darkroom. When he finally came out, he looked pale. The first photos showed the men by their campfire, smiling, beer cans in hand, the kind of easy happiness that makes your chest ache years later. But then the frames shifted, grainy images of trees, a shadow at the edge of the light, then a blurred hand reaching across the lens. The last photo froze me cold. It was a figure half caught in motion, standing just beyond the tents. The light from the fire caught the man's face for a fraction of a second before the image bled to white. I can't explain why, but in that moment I could almost hear it, the hiss of the fire, the whisper of wind through the trees, the brief panic that must have filled that clearing before everything went silent. That's when Daniel said he kept all this hidden for 11 years. Why? We didn't have an answer. All we had was a camera full of ghosts and a map pointing towards something called a burial site. Daniel was a younger man than I'd been when this started, sharper, less patient with silence. He said he'd go find Harvey himself. I told him to take it slow, to listen more than he talked. Men like him, I said, don't lie because they enjoy it. They lie because the truth would drown them. A few days later, Daniel drove across the state to meet him. Harvey was older now, frail, using an oxygen tank. He opened the door, saw the boxes Daniel carried, and said only one thing. "Did you find the place?" When Daniel told me that later, he said the man's eyes went flat, like something inside him had given up. They sat in his living room for over an hour. Harvey spoke quietly, his voice shaking. He admitted he'd seen the 3 friends that night near a restricted trail by the old quarry. Said he warned them not to go that way, but they laughed it off. Later, when they went missing, he claimed he'd found their packs near a slope and meant to turn them in, but didn't. When Daniel asked why, Harvey looked down and said they were already gone. I just didn't want to be next. When Daniel told me this, he didn't sound angry, just hollow. We both knew the ranger was holding something back. Maybe it was fear, maybe guilt. Either way, the line between witness and accomplice had long since blurred. Daniel spent that night going over the map again, tracing each mark, each faint line that led from the lake to a spot deep in the woods. At the bottom corner of the page there was a word, half torn off gray. Something. Maybe garage, maybe grave. That's where part 2 leaves me, sitting at my kitchen table long after midnight, listening to the wind push against the windows and realizing how the past never really ends. It just waits patient and silent until someone finally decides to follow the trail again. I still remember the drive Daniel took that morning. The sun had barely cleared the ridges, lighting the peaks with that sharp Colorado gold, the kind that fades too fast. He had the map laid out across the passenger seat, the blue pencil marks nearly rubbed away from his thumb, tracing them over and over. I stayed back in Clear Rock, but every mile he drove I followed in my mind. The road out to those mountains feels endless pine shadows running alongside the truck dirt kicking up behind you like smoke, the kind of quiet that tests your thoughts. When he finally called, his voice sounded different. "Uncle Frank," he said. "I think I know where he was taking them." Harvey had given him almost nothing during that first talk, just vague mentions of trails, the quarry, and those markings on the map. But when Daniel studied it again, it became clear the circles weren't random. They followed a line of old mining roads, long abandoned, each one deeper and less accessible than the last. The map didn't just show where they'd gone, it looked like someone's record of hiding something. He told me he'd take 2 rangers with him to check the first site marked Log Pit. It sat near an old logging area, maybe 4 miles up from the lake. That night, before he left, Daniel stopped by my house. He didn't ask for advice, he just wanted quiet company. We sat on the porch, both watching the sky turn that soft kind of purple before full dark. He said, "If Harvey's telling the truth, those boys didn't just get lost. Someone put them where no one could find them." His words hit like a slow echo. I'd spent years trying to believe in simple explanations, but simple doesn't fit 11 years of silence. The next day they set out. The forest was thick that time of year, branches heavy with sap, the air damp from recent rain. He said the first sight gave them nothing but traces of old fires and a half-buried tarp too small to matter. They moved on to the next circle, higher up an old shaft carved into the mountain, half collapsed and overgrown. They used flashlights to push in about 20 feet before the air turned stale and they had to pull back. Nothing living had been down there for decades. It wasn't until the third site, the one labeled Burial, that things began to shift. He told me it sat near a swampy ridge where the ground dipped and pooled. At first glance, it looked like nothing, just rock and brush, but one of the rangers noticed small craters covered by stones that didn't belong there. They cleared the top layer and found bones, but animal, not human. It was enough to feel both hope and disappointment at once. Then a few yards off, near a fallen tree, Daniel saw what looked like the corner of a tent poking through the mud. The fabric was faded, but he knew it. It matched the brand the missing men had bought for that trip. He crouched there for a long time, tracing the tear marks along the canvas, until he noticed rope tangled in the branches above climbing rope, cut clean, not frayed. He called me that night from the site, his voice low. "They were here, Uncle. Someone cut them loose." I could hear the wind on the line, that same hollow mountain wind that seems to carry its own stories. He said he'd bring the items back for lab testing, but deep down, we both knew no test would change what the evidence already said. This wasn't a natural disappearance. Someone had stopped them from ever leaving those woods. By morning, the town had already caught wind of what was happening. Clear Rock has a way of knowing things before they're meant to be known. Some folks whispered that Daniel was chasing ghosts, reopening a wound the town had long since buried. Others saw it differently. They wanted the truth, no matter how late it came. I heard people at the diner saying maybe the ranger had gone too far, that maybe he'd done something he couldn't undo. The same man who'd once been a hero was now being mentioned in the same breath as guilt. Daniel brought Harvey back in for questioning 2 days later. The old man came willingly, though his eyes were sunken and his breathing labored. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in a decade. When Daniel placed the recovered gear on the table, Jack's flashlight, Thomas's flask, the camera, Harvey stared at them a long time, his lips pressed thin. Finally, he said, "I tried to warn them." His voice cracked when he spoke. There was another man out there that night. At first, Daniel thought he was deflecting, but the way Harvey told it, it almost sounded believable. He said the boys had been drinking by the fire when a stranger wandered into camp, a drifter or maybe a poacher, someone who lived off the land. Words were exchanged, voices raised, and then a shot rang out. Harvey said he'd heard it from down the trail but didn't go closer. "Didn't seem like my place," he muttered. When he came back at dawn, the camp was empty, but the gear was scattered, the fire long cold. He said he panicked, thinking the blood would lead back to him. So he gathered what was left, hid it, and stayed quiet. It's strange hearing a confession that doesn't quite confess. Harvey wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling the whole truth either. You can feel that, as an investigator, the parts of a story that don't breathe right. When Daniel pressed him for the stranger's name, the ranger said he didn't know, only that he'd seen the man before, along the northern trail. Said he was known for setting illegal traps, the kind that could snap a leg clean through. He didn't take kindly to being told where he could hunt, Harvey added. But there was no report, no arrest, no record of such a man ever existing. Still, Harvey's words gave the case new shape. If the poacher was real, he might have been violent, territorial, desperate. But that didn't explain the map, the deliberate hiding of evidence, or the marks that led to the word burial. Daniel called in a few retired rangers men who'd worked those same woods, asking if they remembered anyone who matched Harvey's vague description. Most shrugged it off. One said there had been a loner living off the land back then, a man named Grady or Gray, who'd vanished around the same time the friends did. That half-written word at the bottom of the map suddenly carried new weight. Maybe it had never meant grave at all. Maybe it was gray. When Daniel told me that theory, the room went still. It made sense in a way the others hadn't. Harvey's fear, his silence, the hidden gear, it all pointed to someone he knew, someone he couldn't afford to cross. I asked Daniel what he'd do next. He said he'd re-interview the witnesses from 2012. Anyone who'd camped nearby. Anyone who might have seen a light or heard a voice that night. One of them, an older man named Carter, had been fishing the morning after the disappearance. He told Daniel he saw a ranger's truck drive past the lake before sunrise. He remembered it clearly because the headlights caught the water in a strange way. That detail hit like a stone. There were no scheduled patrols at that hour. Only one person had reason to be out there, then Harvey himself. When Daniel confronted him with that, Harvey didn't deny it. He said he'd gone back to make sure no one else got hurt. But his eyes gave away something deeper. You didn't want anyone finding what you'd seen, Daniel said quietly. The old man's hands trembled. "If you'd been there," Harvey replied, "you'd have done the same." I still think about that line. It's the kind of sentence that stays with you long after the conversation ends. The kind that makes you wonder which part of the truth a man's trying to protect his conscience or his survival. That night, Daniel drove back up to the lake, retracing the route on the map one last time before dark. He followed the arrow drawn near the word gray through dense underbrush and rock that crumbled underfoot. When he reached a small clearing at the base of a cliff, he noticed an indentation in the ground, like a shallow sinkhole. He crouched down, shone his light, and saw fragments of wood buried under dirt. He brushed it away slowly, an old frame, maybe a crate or box, and beneath it a scrap of denim worn thin by time. The patch on the back pocket still carried the faint outline of a name, Fields. He called me just before midnight, his voice a whisper. "We found Thomas's jeans," he said, and a casing, a single bullet lodged in the dirt. For a long time, neither of us spoke. There's something unbearable about hearing the first tangible proof of death after years of uncertainty. It's not relief. It's a kind of finality that feels like ice settling in your chest. He told me he was calling for a full forensic team that they'd comb every inch by morning. I told him to be careful, to remember that the truth doesn't always protect the living. Before hanging up, he said something I'll never forget. "You know, Uncle Frank, those mountains are still keeping secrets. I just don't think they're Harvey's anymore." When the line went dead, I sat there a long while, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the wind pressing against the windows. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled across the ridges. And for the first time in over a decade, I realized the story of those three friends wasn't finished, not yet. Something darker was still buried out there, waiting for its name to be spoken. When Daniel called that night, I could hear the weight in his voice before he even said a word. He told me they'd confirmed the jeans belonged to Thomas Fields. The bullet casing, too, was real modern, not some old relic from the mining days. There was no denying now that those three boys had met violence, not misfortune. After all these years, it was finally clear someone had killed them. I didn't say much on the phone. There are moments in a man's life when words feel too small to fit the truth. All I could manage was, "You did the right thing finding them." When we hung up, I sat there in the dark kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator steady as breath, and stared at the empty chair across from me. That was where Jack used to sit years back, drinking coffee before heading out to fix someone's truck. It hit me then that his chair had been empty for over a decade, and the silence in that room had never really ended. Daniel kept the investigation moving, working through every sliver of evidence. He sent teams back to the mine where the scent dogs had picked up traces, and they came back with more of what we feared: Michael Randall's wallet, his pocket knife, a few coins fused with rust. No remains, but enough to tell us those men had never left that mountain alive. The lab confirmed the bullet was a .30 caliber hunting round, same type used by locals for deer. It narrowed the field, but not enough to name a killer. By then, Ron Harvey had gone from witness to suspect in most people's eyes, though no one could prove anything. Daniel decided to bring him in one more time. I sat in on that interview. Harvey looked worse than before, thinner, his hands trembling so bad he couldn't hold his coffee. He didn't deny being near the campsite that night. He said he'd been patrolling when he heard voices arguing by the water. 3 young men, 1 stranger. He didn't see the man's face, just his outline in the firelight. The stranger shouted something, then came the shot. Harvey said he froze. "I didn't go near it," he kept saying. "Didn't want to make it worse." In the morning, the campsite was torn apart, the men gone. When Daniel asked why he didn't report it, Harvey's answer came out barely a whisper. "Because I knew they'd blame me. It wasn't enough to charge him, but it was enough to damn him in the court of public opinion." News traveled fast in a town like ours. The Denver papers ran the story for a week: old ranger concealed evidence in missing hikers case. Reporters parked outside the station. Folks who'd once called Harvey a hero now crossed the street to avoid him. He told Daniel he'd found the camera in the trees the next day, developed the film himself, and saw a man's face on the last frame. He panicked, thinking it would tie him to the scene. "So I hid it," he admitted, "because what if it wasn't him? What if it was me they came for?" His eyes watered as he said it. There's a kind of guilt that doesn't need words. It just hangs in the air, thick as smoke. Daniel worked the case like a man who knew time was running out. He looked through old poaching files, trying to find anyone who'd been caught near those trails back in 2012. A few names came up: locals who'd lost their hunting licenses, men known for carrying rifles out of season, but nothing solid. One name stood out: a drifter called Graydon Price, rumored to have lived off the grid north of the lake. No address, no family, no record after 2013. The name Gray from the map made a kind of cruel sense. Daniel thought Harvey had written it himself, maybe as a reminder, maybe as a warning. He followed every thread, every rumor. Some said Price was dangerous. Others swore he'd left the state long ago. Daniel found a retired warden who remembered seeing him around that year. Tall guy, he said, wild eyes, carried a bolt-action rifle he never let out of reach. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to paint a picture. Meanwhile, Harvey's health was failing. He'd moved to a nursing facility on the edge of town, and Daniel went there often trying to get one final confession. Harvey never said the words outright, but one afternoon he muttered something that chilled Daniel to the bone. "I told him to walk away," he said. "Told him those boys didn't mean harm. He didn't listen." After that, Daniel called me. He said, "Uncle Frank, I think we've got our man, but he's long gone." His voice was tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something too heavy for too long. He asked if I believed Harvey's story about the poacher. I told him belief doesn't matter much in cases like this. It's what you can prove. Still, I knew in my gut there was truth buried in there somewhere, just twisted by fear and time. A week later, Daniel organized a final search of the area near the mine. He brought in cadaver dogs and a small excavation team, hoping to find what was left. The terrain was treacherous, loose rock, shifting soil, the smell of damp earth that clung to everything. I went with them that morning, standing back near the ridge while the crew worked. You could hear the shovels cutting into the dirt, the quiet murmur of men who knew they were digging for ghosts. Hours passed with nothing but stones and roots. Then one of the handlers called out they'd hit something metallic. It wasn't a body, not even bone. It was an old hunting knife, half-buried blade, still sharp. On the handle were the faint initials M.R. Michael Randall. Daniel crouched beside it, his gloved hands shaking slightly. He didn't speak for a long time. The light was fading through the trees, painting everything in gray and gold. He finally said, "This is enough." And maybe it was. Enough to prove the men had been hunted enough to close the distance between rumor and truth. The case went before the state attorney that fall. Without a body or a living suspect, it was ruled a probable homicide with insufficient evidence for prosecution. The official record used words like presumed likely and unrecoverable. But to us, the meaning was plain: they were gone, and the man who did it would never face a judge. Harvey died 3 months later. They found him in his sleep, the window open, the mountain air pouring in. On the bedside table was a small envelope addressed to the sheriff. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a rusted compass. The note said, "You'll find what's left in the mine. I tried to do right, but I was too late. No signature, just those words." Daniel took the compass with him when he went back one final time. The mine had collapsed years earlier, and digging deeper risked bringing the whole thing down. They marked the site with a cross of stones, placed the compass at its base, and walked away. For a while, the town grew quiet again. Families finally had something to hold on to, a truth, even if it came without justice. I watched Daniel give Jack's sister the flashlight we'd recovered from the box. She held it like it was made of glass, running her thumb over the engraved initials. "He always said this thing would outlast him," she said softly, and in a way it had. Sometimes late at night I still drive up toward Crystal Lake. The road winds through miles of silence past the old ranger outpost that's now boarded up. The air changes there, it gets colder, thinner, as if the mountains are reminding you how small you are. I'll pull over, kill the engine, and just listen. There's no sound except the wind moving through the trees and the faint lap of water on the shore. In that stillness, I think about those boys, their laughter echoing through a place that swallowed them whole. I think about Harvey, the man who tried to bury his mistakes and ended up buried by them. And I think about Daniel still carrying the case file in his desk, unable to close it even after the state did. The truth I've learned doesn't always come with peace. Sometimes it just sits beside you in the dark quiet, but unyielding. And that night, as the wind rolled down off the ridge, I realized the story wasn't quite done. There was still one piece missing, one last detail that might finally set it to rest. Daniel had mentioned something odd about the camera. One frame they'd overlooked, buried deep in the negatives, a photograph that didn't fit the others. He said he'd have it developed again just to be sure. I told him I'd meet him at the station in the morning. But even as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever showed up in that final photograph wasn't just evidence. It was the face of the truth we'd been chasing all along, and the truth I feared was about to look back. When Daniel called me that morning, his voice was quieter than usual, almost careful. He'd gotten the photograph back, the one he thought the lab had missed before. I remember standing by the window looking out over the pines while he told me what they'd found. There was no mystery left in his tone, no sharp edge of discovery, just something tired and settled. He said the image was clear now, developed properly this time. It showed the same 3 young men by the fire, but this frame caught more off to the side, half-shadowed by the trees, was a face. Not clear enough to name, but human enough to know. Someone had been standing there watching. And that was all he said. For a long time after that, there wasn't much more anyone could do. The prosecutor called the case concluded by evidence and inference, which is a careful way of saying the truth had been found, just not proven. Officially, it stayed unsolved. But everyone who'd worked it, myself included, knew that night on the mountain wasn't chance or accident. 3 good men had met someone dangerous, and fear had done the rest. The law needs more than that. It needs bodies, names, testimony. The truth on its own rarely fits the paperwork. Ron Harvey's note. The one Daniel found after the ranger passed was the last tangible piece of the story. They buried him up in the small cemetery near the ridge, the same hill where the search parties used to meet before heading into the woods. A few old rangers came to the service. Daniel stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, watching the pine needles drift over the fresh dirt. I think he saw Harvey for what he was. Not a monster. Not a saint. Just a man who made a coward's choice and spent the rest of his life paying for it. Regret can be a quiet executioner. It doesn't swing fast. It just stays. The families came to town that spring. Jack's sister, Michael's mother, and Thomas's older brother, they all gathered in front of the sheriff's office holding what little was returned. Jack's flashlight, Michael's pocket knife, the torn edge of a tent that had once held their laughter. We'd laid those things out on the table the day before, each one tagged, cleaned, cataloged, and I remember thinking how strange it was to see a life reduced to a handful of objects. It's not something you ever get used to. They thanked Daniel for not giving up, for giving them at least a version of the truth to hold. He told them the same thing I once told him: the truth doesn't end grief. It just gives it shape. After the press left and the papers stopped calling, the story faded like all stories do. The lake went quiet again. The tourists came back. The cabins filled in summer the same way they always had. People fished, hiked, built fires. You'd never know what had happened there unless someone told you. But for those of us who lived it, the silence changed. Every gust of wind through those trees seemed to carry a memory. Every ripple on the water felt like a whisper. I think that's the part no one tells you about closure. It doesn't close anything. It just folds the past into the landscape until you can't tell where it starts or ends. Daniel stayed on as sheriff another few years. The case never left his desk, though he didn't speak of it much. I'd find him sometimes at the old outpost, sitting on the tailgate of his truck, staring out over the ridge. He'd say, "I keep thinking about that map, Uncle Frank. All those marks, all those lines. Someone took the time to draw it to keep track of where they'd been. Maybe that was their way of burying the truth." He never said who he thought it was, the stranger, the ranger, or someone else entirely. By then I think he understood it didn't matter. The mountains had already taken what they wanted. I retired for good the following year. Moved out closer to the valley where the air is warmer and the nights don't echo the same way. Still, sometimes I wake before dawn, drive the old road up toward Crystal Lake, and park where the trees thin out. There's a turn just before the overlook where you can see the water spread out like glass. It's the kind of stillness that makes you forget how dangerous quiet can be. I've stood there in the half-light, listening to nothing but the wind through the pines, and thought about those boys, how young they were, how sure they must have felt lighting that last fire, how quickly peace can turn to terror. People always ask me if I think Harvey killed them. I tell them I don't. He saw what happened, maybe even could have stopped it, but I think his sin was fear, not blood. The stranger, if he was real, disappeared long before the law caught up. Some men are born to vanish. They live without roots, without names that anyone remembers. But the damage they do stays. It stays in the people who loved the victims, in the quiet way the town hesitates every time a new group of hikers heads up the mountain. It stays in the air like a scent you can't quite place but always recognize. The last time Daniel and I went up there together, it was late fall. The leaves had turned and the first snow dusted the peaks. We brought a wooden cross carved with 3 names, Jack, Michael, and Thomas, and placed it near the trailhead. Daniel nailed it into the soil himself, his breath coming out in short clouds. "That's where the search started," he said. "Seems right it should end here too." We stood there a long while not talking. The sound of the lake carried softly through the trees. For the first time in years, I felt the story settle, not finished, but at rest. When I think about it now, it's not the fear that stays with me. It's the friendship. Those 3 boys who just wanted a weekend by the fire, who packed light and laughed loud and trusted the world to be kind. That's what I choose to remember. Because every case leaves a scar. But this one taught me something deeper, that truth without mercy can't heal anyone. And silence, no matter how long it lasts, doesn't erase what we owe the dead. Sometimes when the radio's off and the night is still, I imagine the flash of that camera one last time. The laughter froze in the trees behind them dark, and somewhere just out of frame, the shape of a man watching. The photo stopped there, but life didn't. The world kept moving, the seasons kept changing, and somehow we all learned to live beside the unanswered. Maybe that's all justice really is, the choice to keep remembering. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.